Hey everybody, Corey McCullough here, author of fantasy, science fiction, historical fiction, and pretty much anything else that pops into my head. I'm back again reviewing the audiobook files for Rust on the Allegheny, my historical fiction novel that takes place in a Pennsylvania town that changed the world. It's a multi-generational historical fiction novel that jumps back and forth between the modern day, the 1930s and the 1980s, and I've done a couple videos where I'm reviewing the audio files and we're kind of proofreading them and making sure that there aren't many mistakes, that the narrator maybe missed a word here or anything that we need to have revised. I'm going through and I'm reviewing all the audio files alongside the PDF version of the book so that I can, just mark down wherever anything needs changed. So without further ado, we're going to jump right into it. Now, the narrator for this book, his name is Michael Beckett, and so far, I'm super impressed with everything he's done. He's done a fantastic job on all of these chapters that I've reviewed so far. He does really cool voices. I've mentioned this before, but like when audiobooks have narrators who maybe try too hard with some of the voices that they're doing, whether it's a male narrator who's doing female voices or a female narrator who's doing male voices or adults who are doing kid voices, sometimes it can be a little distracting. I find that Michael's take on it is he acts as if he's that character and he does do voices, but not so much that it becomes a distraction. And I've been really pleased with what he's done so far. It's really cool. And there's some chapters later on in this book that I'm really interested to see some of his performance choices. So here we go. We're on chapter 21. This is in the perspective of the main character, Owen, and it takes place in the modern day. Let's see. Yeah, chapter 21. Here we go.
Chapter 21, Latonia City, Pennsylvania, December 2019. Despite the strong assertion he had made during his argument with his father, Owen McCullough did not quit his job. In fact, he continued to work faithfully at the paper for weeks that turned into months. Before he knew it, it was December of 2019, and he had been working at the Oildham Morning Herald for almost 5 months. He still did not know why the name was hyphenated, and he very much doubted that he ever would. But he had witnessed his daughter taking her wobbly first steps and saying her first words, and he and Kayla had signed the papers to take over Ruth Lee's mortgage, and they had moved out of the little rented house with its neighbors within arm's reach and into Ruth Lee's country home. And, hoping to smooth over some of the rough patches that had been brought on by his daily 6 to midnight schedule, Owen had bought his wife a puppy, a Welsh corgi named Bandit. He knew it was shameless, but in marriage sometimes one had to score points however one could.
This is based at least partially on reality. I had a Welsh corgi named Bandit. We bought him as a puppy. I did not buy it for my wife to smooth over a rough patch. We bought it together. He was awesome. I know everybody says that their dog is the best dog in the world, the best dog ever. In this case, Bandit was the best dog ever. Don't try to tell me otherwise. I will fight you.
It was a Thursday afternoon, and Owen had just woken up to prepare for work. Kayla was still at work, and Ruth Lee was watching Emma while Owen slept. This was their standard daily schedule. But as he emerged from the bedroom that he and Kayla shared at the back of his mother-in-law's house, the place was quiet. A lot had happened in the past few months, but there was one thing that had not happened. Owen hadn't once spoken with his father. Not a word had been exchanged between them since their argument on the golf course, not even on the day that he and Kayla had moved out of their tiny rented house and into Ruth Lee's place. Owen's mother had come over, bringing a housewarming gift of freshly baked cookies, apologizing and explaining that Owen's father had been busy that day. Such a long-lasting fight was unprecedented in the McCullough family. Owen went to the kitchen, poured himself a cup of coffee from Ruth Lee's ancient-looking coffee maker, then went into the dining room to look out the bay window where 2 cactus plants and a flowering peace plant grew in pots on the sill. There, the reason for the house's silence became clear. It was a sunny, warmer than usual day for early December, and Ruth Lee was taking advantage of it. Emma, as usual, was strapped into the small pink plastic swing in the tree, and her head tilted to the side, asleep. Under the swing, Bandit the corgi puppy and a mostly beagle named Wilma lay in the grass. Ruth Lee was on her knees nearby, holding a can of WD-40 in one hand and an old rag in the other, tending to a rusty, child-sized bike.
Wilma was also a dog that I had. My wife found her on the side of the road and put up posters and signs and tried to find where she had come from. She was skinny and malnourished and very scared, and it wasn't intentional, but Wilma became our dog for years. Wilma was around for a long time. She was also awesome. She was not the best dog in the world. She was a beagle, and beagles like to eat trash. Every time we left the house, she would eat trash and pee on the floor and poop on the floor every single time. Didn't matter what she did. But she was still awesome. She was not the best dog in the world, but still loved her. She was great.
"What the?" said Owen. He squinted, and...
So we've got a little change here. Owen is saying, "What is..." And Michael said, "What the..." I don't really care enough to have him change that, though.
Realized that Ruth Lee was tending to the same bike that Kayla had discovered on the front porch of the little rented house on 322 months ago, before the move, the one that one of the neighbor kids had left there. Owen took another sip of coffee, tossed on a light jacket, and stepped outside. Immediately, Ruth Lee looked up. Even in her late 70s, her ears were still good enough to hear a screen door turning on well-greased hinges. Bandit and Wilma were slower on the uptake. Owen had taken a few steps before the dogs rushed over to greet him. He got down on his knees, petting them both, playfully rolling Bandit over and ruffling the fur behind his long, perked-up ears. He still had those sharp puppy teeth, but he never bit hard. "You get enough sleep?" asked Ruth Lee. The volume of her voice, high-pitched and sweet at most times but capable of sharpness when necessary, indicated that she was not concerned with Emma waking up. "You bet," said Owen. Still engaged in a one-handed wrestling match with Bandit, he gestured with his coffee cup. "Where did you find that bike?" "Have you been looking for it?" asked Ruth Lee. She started to push herself up off the ground and didn't manage it the first time. Owen moved forward to help her, but by the time he got there, she'd done it on her own steam. "No," answered Owen. "It's not even ours." She made a face. "Not yours?" "No," said Owen. "How did it get here?" "Uh-oh," said Ruth Lee. Then she slapped a hand to her head, blew a raspberry, and erupted in a peal of laughter that excited Bandit enough to make him jump and yip. "Oh, my. I've had this in the garage since Yuns moved in here. It was on your porch when you were moving. I thought it was yours, so I tossed it in that trailer and brought it over here. Put it in the back of the garage and forgot about it." A flash of something crossed Ruth Lee's face. The look she made when she remembered something that made her shift topics in mid-thought, which she tended to do a lot. "Oh, did you want me to make you something for dinner since Kayla's working late tonight?" "She's working late?" said Owen. "Busy day, apparently. She didn't text you." Owen shook his head. It had been several days since he'd received one of the midday texts that Kayla always used to send him during her lunch hour, just to let him know how her day was going. Sometimes it felt like they barely saw each other anymore. And when they did, it was either after a long, hard shift or as one of them was rushing to prepare for the next one. Weekends were usually spent recovering from the week and arguing over little things.
I don't know if you caught it, but Ruth Lee in there, we had an occurrence of Yuns, which is a Western Pennsylvania thing. You hear it a lot, like in reference to Pittsburgh, which people say like yins, like they call Pittsburghers yinzers, because it's like a combination of, well, it's just like you and an apostrophe S. Use, you gonna do this? Use, or yuns. Around here, in the book, I don't spell it Y-I-N-Z the way that you know, people typically in the Pittsburgh area, they think of like yins. Around here, which I'm in more of north or midwestern Pennsylvania, they tend to pronounce it yuns. So like Y-O-U-N-S, yuns. So Yun's going over there. How Yun's doing? Ruth Lee, she just used a Yun's.
Kayla's job was stressful and took its toll on her every day, and Owen knew that his schedule at the paper only added to her overall stress. He wanted to fix it, to save her from it, but he didn't know how. The distance between them was growing. He wouldn't have said they were fighting necessarily, but they seemed to be constantly getting the worst of one another. I wonder if she's
So I don't know. What do you think? Does it change the intended meaning that he says they were constantly getting the worst of each other? I wrote they were consistently getting the worst of each other. Constantly getting the worst of each other versus consistently. I think it's okay. I try to minimize the amount of changes that I make the narrator go back and do, because it can actually introduce more problems. Because I think I mentioned this in a previous video, but if you've ever been listening to an audiobook and then all of a sudden a line seems like it's a little louder, or the narrator's voice seems like, oh, it's deeper in this part than it is in the rest of the paragraph, or it just sounds a little bit different, it's probably because they went back and re-recorded it. And there's so many variables that can change how the voice sounds, or, you know, how the line is delivered, or it could be down to just like different environmental conditions that day can cause the line to sound differently. So do I want to potentially introduce like an inconsistency there just because there's a word that's slightly different? I don't think it changes the intended meaning very much. It doesn't change the story. So I'm going to let that one go too.
left work yet, said Ruth Lee. Let's find out. And she pulled the cell phone from her pocket. Owen resisted the urge to roll his eyes. It had taken Ruth Lee several years to fully embrace the idea of carrying a cell phone, but boy, had she embraced it. Owen thought that the ability to track someone's location using their phone was a bit much, even a little creepy. But Ruth Lee loved it. Nope, said Ruth Lee after a few harder-than-necessary taps on her phone's screen. Still at work. She pinched her fingers on the screen to zoom in. And in the north wing of the facility, looks like. Good to know, said Owen. Ruth Lee put her phone away and slapped the handlebars of the bike, laughing at herself all over again. Well, guess I'd better take this old thing back over and ask your old neighbors if anybody's been looking for it. I was wondering why you bought Emma a bike in such rough shape, but I thought maybe it was a hand-me-down. The possibility gave Owen pause. He looked hard at the bike. Its surfaces were coated in rust with faded yellow paint on the body. The rubber grips on the handlebars were suffering from dry rot. The spokes were brown with jagged surfaces, and the tires were as flat as tires can be. Leaning forward, he saw that there was a piece of foam between the handlebars. A thin strip of fabric clung to the foam that read, in flaming, extreme-looking font that was badly faded, "Too cool for words." And beneath it, hanging from a dirty old plastic zip tie, was a keychain that read, Seneca County Fish Hatchery, Kearsburg, PA. And just like that, the penny dropped. Suddenly, Owen could see the extreme-looking font not so faded, the tires not so flat. The yellow paint, he realized, only looked yellow because it had been bleached by long days or years beneath the sun. It had been green once, a bright electric shade of green. He could feel himself riding. Remembered how, when you first started out, the gearless little rig's tires would spin in place and throw up gravel behind you before the treads could find enough purchase to propel you forward. And that zip tie. He remembered taking it from a tiny storage container of plastic drawers on his father's workbench and using it to attach that keychain he'd gotten as a souvenir from his Cub Scout troop's visit to the fish hatchery. Why he had wanted it so prominently displayed, he could only imagine. But he had done it. He had. "This is my bike," Owen said, then repeated, "This is my bike." "I won't tell if you won't," said Ruth Lee. I doubt anybody will come looking for it after all this time. A bit of a lemon anyway, if you ask me. No, I mean, it's mine, said Owen. Jeez, this was my bike when I was a kid. He stepped forward and touched the dry, rotted rubber of the handlebars. One memory gave way to another. He could see the wrapping paper coming off of it on Christmas morning. It hadn't really been wrapped, per se, so much as draped in paper with a bow stuck on top. He couldn't have been older than 5 or 6 years old at the time. The obvious question was how, 20-some years later, it had found its way onto his back porch. The just as obvious answer was that his father or mother had brought it over and left it there. And the fact that not a word had been said about it pointed to his father.
Okay, a quick little comment or two here. First of all, this is sort of based on a true story. A bike showed up on my back porch the one day, and I was like, where did this come from? Where did this old rusty bike come from? This thing looks ancient. And it took me days to realize it was my old bike. And it wasn't my parents who had brought it over. It was my old babysitter from when I was a kid. And she didn't tell me at the time. So it wasn't until a couple days later that I thought to text her and be like, did you bring this over? And she said, oh yeah, I brought over your old bike. I found it in storage. But for a few days, I had no idea where the bike had come from. I didn't realize it was mine. And then it was like all at once, I recognized the little keychain on it. And I was just like, oh, this is my bike. And the memories all came flooding back. And the other thing I wanted to mention, so in reviewing some of my writing here, there are definitely things that I see that bug me, that I would do differently if I were to go back and make some changes to this book. There's this line here that says, he couldn't have been older than 5 or 6 years old at the time. Now, I'm nitpicking myself, but you don't need to say it that way. You could either say, he couldn't have been older than 5 or 6. There we go. Or you could say, he couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old at the time. I shouldn't have put, he couldn't have been older than 5 or 6 years old at the time. Again, I'm nitpicking myself, but that's what I tend to do. I'm a little bit of a perfectionist when it comes to this stuff. And a little bit of a control freak over these things. So I could go back and change that, but you know, what's done is done. It's not really a big deal, but I thought maybe I should mention that there are things like that I see all the time that I'm like, okay, I would change that if I had the chance, but you can't do it with everything. You have to just, you know, it's out there. It is what it is. You just have to accept it sometimes.
He brought my old bike over, thought Owen, and left it without saying a word. The sheer absurdity of it struck Owen, and he shook his head in frustration. Ruth Lee, he said, I do not understand my father. I imagine, said Ruth Lee, that you aren't the first young man to feel that way, but it might help if you spoke with him. Owen grimaced. Ruth Lee Hart Woodford was not a woman known to pull her punches, and he had walked right into that one. How long has it been? She asked. I haven't heard from him in 4 or 5 months. He's acting like a child. He didn't even call or text when we moved out of the old house. So that means you can't call or text? Said Ruth Lee. Or go over and visit? Well, if he doesn't want me to, Owen began, but he didn't finish. He doesn't have the only say in the matter, said Ruth Lee. You only get one father, and if he was gone tomorrow, it wouldn't be his fault you hadn't talked. Owen said nothing. Someone once said, Ruth Lee went on, that a man ought to forgive his brother 70 times 7 times. I imagine the same applies to a father. Your dad lost the right to be a boy, to act like a child, to use your words, the day his father died. So if he's acting like a child now, maybe there's something else going on you don't know about. Maybe, just this once. He needs you to be the man in the relationship for him. Ruth Lee brushed her hands off on her pants. Well, I'm heading in to get a drink, she said. Relationship for him. Ruth Lee brushed her hands off on her pants.
Little mistake here.
I'm heading in to get a drink.
Yep, just a little mistake there. That's one of those things that as the narrator, Michael is going through, he edits his work as he goes. But every once in a while, there's going to be something like that you just forget, like, oh, I need to go back and fix that little inconsistency there, this little disfluency. So this is why I review the files, because it would be easy for something like that to slip through. So I'm making a note of the timestamp of where that occurs, chapter 21 at the 11:04 to 11:08 mark. And so he can go back, because I don't have the ability to really edit the files through here. So I'll just ask him to go back, chop out that little part, and it'll be good.
She said, "Can I get you anything?" Owen felt that he could barely speak. "No, thank you," he managed after a few seconds. His mother-in-law headed toward the screen door. As she pulled it open, she turned toward the dogs. "You coming?" she asked. Wilma the beagle lumbered after her. Her comma-shaped tail wagged back and forth, slapping hard against the doorframe as she entered the house. But Bandit remained sitting at Owen's feet, looking expectantly up at him. Owen got down on his knees and scratched the top of Bandit's head. A thought occurred to him, and he rolled up the sleeve of his jacket to look at his left elbow. There was a small semicircle of white in the skin on his funny bone, a scar he'd gotten from riding the bike in front of him too fast down a gravel driveway as a boy. He'd forgotten all about it, but now he could remember everything, right down to what the weather had been like that day. He remembered how the front tire had twisted between two larger than usual chunks of gravel, causing him to pitch forward. How he'd landed and looked down to see a piece of skin missing, which had frightened him more than it had hurt. He remembered the smell of the freshly cut grass, and the shirt his dad had been wearing when he'd come to lift him up and carry him to the house for a Band-Aid and an orange push-pop.
All right, on to chapter 22.
Chapter 22. An hour later, light snow was falling, and Owen was just stepping out of the front door when he saw Kayla pulling into the driveway. She parked in the driveway and for a moment just sat there in the car. He waited, but she didn't get out. He walked toward the car. When she saw him coming, she opened the door, but even before he said hello, he noticed her body language. Rapid blinking, clenched jaw, red nose. She'd been crying. "Are you okay?" said Owen. "Fine," Kayla said. She wore baby blue scrubs and her long dark hair was done up in a tight bun. She wouldn't look at him but tried to step past him toward the house. "Kayla," said Owen, "what's wrong?" "Nothing," she said, "just a bad day at work." "Did something happen?" said Owen. "Nothing, really," Kayla said, glancing at the time on her phone. "Don't you need to get going?" Owen looked at his phone, too. He did need to get going. When he looked back up, she was biting her lip, clearly trying not to start crying again. "Kayla," said Owen, touching her on the shoulder. "Are you okay?" She made an exasperated noise in her throat. "What do you want me to say? Yes?" Owen felt his forehead pinch as he tried to restrain his annoyance. "I just want to know what's wrong." "Well, I'd be happy to tell you, but 30 seconds in the driveway isn't going to cut it." "Fine. Sorry for trying." If his goal had been to get her attention, that one had done it. Now she was looking at him. "So I'm not trying?" said Kayla. "Just because I don't want to talk when you're ready to talk, it means I'm not trying?" "I didn't realize I needed to make an appointment," said Owen. The annoyance he had managed to hold back up until now broke through, loud and clear. "Next time, I won't bother." Kayla stared at him for a moment, then turned away. She rubbed her hands against her shoulders, shivering against the cold. Owen shut his eyes, already regretting his words and hating himself for not keeping his cool. When Kayla turned back to him, she was wiping away fresh tears. "I just had a bad day, that's all," she said. "I'm sorry," Owen said, and he meant it. "I didn't mean to. I'm just sorry, that's all." "I know," said Kayla. "We will get through this," said Owen. She nodded. but not in a way that said she believed him. "I'm cold," she said, and she started toward the house. "Have a good day at work." "We will get through this," Owen said again, this time to her back, and thought, "We will, won't we?" Standing alone in the snow, he watched the door of the house swing shut behind her. Chapter 23. When something bothered Owen McCulloch, his response was usually to do everything in his power to avoid thinking about it at all costs. So, as he sat in his red Ford Focus, waiting at the same red light he got stuck at almost every day on his way to work, he was trying not to think about Kayla. But the more he tried not to think about her, the more he thought about her, and the tears in her eyes, and the way her jaw always clenched when she'd been crying. And the more he thought about all that, the more he hated himself for taking a bad day and making it even worse for her, and the more he worried about their future. He looked up through the driving snow at the marvelous facade of the Derrick Theater. At this time of year, it was nearly dark by 5 o'clock in the evening, and the snow made the visibility far worse. But he had practically memorized the features on the front of that grand old building, given that he had so many chances to stop and look at it every day. And now that it looked like the theater would indeed be torn down this summer, he paid even closer attention. Owen detested the idea. Demolishing a defunct parking garage was one thing, but this was the Derrick. He hoped that someone would at least have the courtesy to chisel off and preserve the carved theatrical masks on the building's heights before they destroyed the place. It would be strange to look up and not see those empty stone eye sockets gazing back down at him, or that lone, gnarled tree that grew inconceivably from the corner of the roof. When the light turned green, Owen proceeded through the town, his wipers swiping slowly at the snow accumulating on the windshield. As much as he hated the change, it wasn't surprising given Latonia City's depressed, blighted status. Back in the late 1800s, Pennsylvania crude had been some of the highest quality oil to be found anywhere on Earth, and nowhere was it more prevalent than it had been here. Hence the region's nickname, the Valley that changed the world. But the real story was what this had done to the region's people. In a strange bit of serendipity, drilling rights had made many a lucky landholder into a millionaire. And even after the industry had dried up and left town, trust funds managed at the Latonia National Bank had kept the local economy afloat for a time. But with no fresh influx of commercial enterprise, the city had slid into a decline, and it was still falling. Dave White, the ginger cat-loving photographer at the paper, had turned out to be a man of strong convictions and many, many theories, not all of which would have been wise to share in polite company. And for some reason, he seemed to enjoy sharing them with Owen any chance he got. Dave White had, on multiple occasions, condemned the local rich boys who were the sons and daughters of farmers lucky enough to have owned oil-soaked ground, and content to live off their family money and enjoy the ride while it lasted. Owen didn't know about all that, but he couldn't deny that Latonia City seemed cursed to never escape the shadow of its former glory, and Owen knew a thing or two about curses. Though the snow slowed him down a bit, he still arrived at the Oildom News-Herald with a few minutes to spare before his shift started. Not long enough to dally, but long enough to quietly say hello to Felicia at the front desk as she was packing up to leave, and ask if her kids were excited for Christmas.
Gonna make a note there at the 325 mark. Chapter 23, 325. He says quietly when it should be quickly.
"Excited?" was her response. "You have no idea. Just wait until yours is old enough." Owen smiled at the thought. "Have they been to the mall to see Santa yet?" "Yes, and now they want to go back a second time," she said as she slipped a hat over her head, careful not to muss her long silver-purple hair. "I swear, we do all this work, and then we give the guy in the red all the credit. I have no idea why we do this to ourselves. By next year, Emma will be old enough that you'll get to join in the fun." "I can't wait," said Owen, and he meant it. "Well, good luck tonight," said Felicia. "This place has been nuts today. I still don't get why you came back to work in our rinky-dink newspaper." She had meant it to be funny, and normally Owen would have favored her with a polite, light-hearted response. But today, all he could muster was a sigh and a, "Yeah, me neither." Felicia winced. "That came out wrong. I didn't mean that to be, negative or anything." "It's okay," said Owen. He hesitated. There was a part of him that did want to explain the decision to her, to tell her about how the demands of his old job, constantly traveling and spending 5 nights a week in hotel rooms, had nearly destroyed his marriage. How, as much as he'd enjoyed the work, he had left that position to save his relationship with Kayla and spend more time with her. How, as hesitant as he'd been to move back to his hometown, he'd done it to provide Emma with a good place to grow up, and so he could be closer and have a better relationship with his parents. Those were the reasons why he had come back, but he didn't have the heart to articulate this, considering the irony that he was presently failing on almost all of these fronts. The conflicts must have shown on his face, because Felicia stepped around her desk and placed a hand on his shoulder, rubbing it softly. "Hang in there," she said. "I'm trying," Owen said. As Felicia exited through the front doors, Owen proceeded into the back, where he turned the corner and nearly ran straight into May Bauman. "Sorry," he muttered. "No, my fault," she said sweetly, smiling up at him. "Is Felicia still out there?" "She was just leaving as I came in." May pursed her lips. "Shoot, I was going to have her fax something." Owen might have offered to do it for her, if it had been anyone but May, a woman who had not so long ago run an article that had incensed him to the point that he'd considered quitting. "Sorry," he said. "You just missed her." After all, she knew perfectly well how to fax something. "Oh, well, it can wait until tomorrow," said May. "She's a sweet girl, really. It's always nice to see someone like that doing well, even overlooking her lifestyle choices. In a town like this, it's not easy to come from a family with a reputation." She paused and looked up at Owen as if realizing she'd just said something rude. She put a hand to her sternum and said, "Oh dear, no offense, of course." Owen, who had not taken any until now, gave May his thinnest smile. "Don't mention it." "Have a nice night," she said in a sing-song voice as she brushed past him. By the time Owen got to his desk, the few extra minutes he'd had going for him were gone, and he was officially late signing in at his workstation. He had barely finished hitting the enter key, confirming his clock-in time, when the door to Dave Albaugh's office opened. Dave stepped out. As ever, there was a moment when he looked legitimately lost. Then he scanned the room with his wire-framed glasses, spotted Owen, and seemed to be found again. "Owen," he said. "Come over here a minute." And he stepped back into his office. Owen gave his clock-in time a second look. 2 minutes late. He had never been late before, not once. But late was late. One might have expected Dave Albaugh's office to have matched the man, a nucleus of chaos and disorganization threatening to spill out and contaminate everyone and everything around it. Instead, the room was neat and tidy. Owen put it down to the fact that it was almost empty. Dave seemed to keep no mementos, no photos, no extraneous supplies that could have cluttered his desk. In short, his office was clean because there was so little in it to mess it up. It wasn't a bad strategy. Dave sat at his desk, looking down at his computer screen with that look that anybody over a certain age looks at a computer screen, his eyes squinting suspiciously, his nose pointing slightly up in the air, a look on his face as if he'd just smelled a fart. Owen knocked at the doorframe.
Oh, man. I forgot about that line. It's kind of embarrassing that I just made myself laugh. That is so narcissistic. That's ridiculous. Let's listen to it again.
His eyes squinting suspiciously, his nose pointing slightly up in the air, a look on his face as if he'd just smelled a fart. Owen knocked at the doorframe. "Owen," Dave said, looking up. "We were just talking about you. May and I mean." "You were?" Owen said, expecting the worst. She was telling me, said Dave, that she thinks you have a tendency to rewrite as opposed to edit, and that got me thinking. May is talking about retiring soon. No kidding, said Owen, making a mental note to celebrate privately later. Good for her. Yeah, well, I don't know what soon means to her. Could be a month, could be a year, but she's been here forever, and she's thinking about leaving. I've got to be thinking about hiring a replacement. In my head, that meant a replacement for her. But maybe instead of rewriting, you'd like to try your hand at doing the writing yourself. For a moment, Owen had nothing to say. Well, that would... I've never really thought about it before. Is that something you'd be interested in? I'd be willing to give it a shot. As far as I'm concerned, you've proven you know your stuff, said Dave. I know my plan for a dedicated copy desk didn't work out quite as I'd planned, but you rolled with the punches and were patient about the whole thing. He lowered his voice and leaned forward over his desk. And frankly, May's not the only staff writer who's getting up there in years. Their time is passing, and I just think we're wasting your talent on ad space and proofreading. Depending on how it goes, I may just move you into writing full-time. The pay's better. It's a salaried position. Plus, the hours are friendlier for a family man. 10 to 6 instead of 6 to midnight. Owen was usually good at hiding his feelings, but this time he couldn't hold back a smile. A normal schedule. Time with the family. And what if he started making enough for Kayla to quit her job and find some less stressful work? Something that paid a little less, perhaps, but didn't give her so many bad days and make her cry alone in the car on her way home. How do we make this happen? Asked Owen. What do you need from me? Well, it's not a sure thing just yet, said Dave. But now that I know you're interested, I'll see what I can do. Until then, do me a favor and keep this between you and me. Deal? Owen extended a hand across the desk. Thank you, Dave, he said. This means a lot. Dave grabbed Owen's hand and pumped it, then stood and gave him a friendly slap on the shoulder. You deserve it. For now, better get to work, Mr. Archaeologist. Got a long night ahead of us. Yes, sir, said Owen.
All right, I think I'm gonna stop there for today's work. Made it up to chapter 24. One thing that I'm noticing, I only noticed it in this past chapter, in chapter 23. I noticed there, it sounded like his mic was peaking a little bit, which is where it's kind of like, you can look it up and get a description of what it is better than I could probably describe it, but it's just like the volume's a little too high, so it's making it sound a little bit off. Like it's I don't know how to describe it exactly, but you know it when you hear it. His mic seems to be peaking there. So there's a little bit of distortion to it, especially when he's speaking a little bit of higher volume notes. So I'm going to keep an eye out for that in the next chapters, because if it's only that chapter that happened with, you know, it's okay. It's probably not going to cause an issue. I hope that it doesn't continue into the chapters beyond this, because I would hate to have that be an ongoing issue and possibly need him to re-record multiple chapters or anything. I didn't find it to be super distracting. I noticed it a little bit. So that's the first time I've noticed it. I don't think it was happening in any of the previous chapters, but, you know, sometimes audio is tricky in that regard. Like, there's little things that go wrong, and as I said, things change from recording session to recording session. Something is as minor as the environment around you, the humidity in the room, whether or not your vocal cords have been warmed up, like how you're feeling, that can change things. And yeah, it's really no big deal. I'm just gonna keep an eye out for it as I move forward. As always, thank you for joining me and kind of watching over my shoulder as I did some of this work. I appreciate you just watching and joining me in this. If you liked the video, please give it a like. Please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. I think I'm going to keep this up, and I won't always have work like this to do, but I'm always doing something in my author journey, my author work. You can follow me on pretty much all the different social media stuff, and I also have a Patreon where patrons get exclusive behind-the-scenes content and some short stories that I don't share anywhere else. Only the patrons get them. So thank you again for watching, and happy reading and writing.